Hello and welcome to The Bad Take. This is Tamara.
And this is Himal. It's been a while. How long has it been? Like 2.5 years?
It's been more than
For
2 years.
10 or 15 listeners who
Who
have
actually
been
care.
keeping track. Yeah, it's been over 2 years. Right?
It's been over 2
basically
years.
since the pandemic hit.
Yep.
So it's been a while. We're back.
Yeah, we thought we'd address one of the issues that is in the minds of a lot of people at the moment. So we have Rajni Gamage with us. She is a researcher in politics based in Colombo. She holds a PhD from the University of Queensland. So we thought rather than just the two of us faffing about,
Yes.
we'll get someone who's actually knowledgeable
Right.
about
so,
this stuff.
Rajni, do you want to introduce yourself?
I mean, it's what Tamara said, that I basically, research on politics, and I just came back to Sri Lanka last December after, a long time overseas, and it's an intense time, politically speaking, so I think we'll have a lot to speak today.
So we are all well aware of the crisis we are in right now. We are almost bankrupt. We don't have, money for essential supplies, foodstuffs like that, and we are basically in a dire economic crisis and a political crisis as well. And I think
worst in our post-independence history.
Yeah, and also one of the things that I have noticed is that within the masses, I haven't seen any other period where the political consciousness was this high. Like, people are very involved. A lot of people are angry, and they are very involved in all the protests that are going on. They have a lot of demands, and we have seen unprecedented levels of, I would even call it, harmony, which is a bit of a strong word to use given our track record in ethnic conflicts and stuff like that. But people have been demanding a lot of things from the ruling class, and I think, Rajni, you wanted to talk about the fact that all these crises that we are in now is sort of a direct result of a crisis in governance, right? And as we know, post-independence, we've always had an elite class governing us, and I think the people have now realized. I think people always knew it, but now we have realized that it's the elites have their own interest at heart and not ours.
Yeah, I think if you look at Sri Lanka's post-independence history, there have been very turbulent periods in our history, right? But I think that the current moment is so historic because you have several crises coming together. So you have the economic crisis, but then you have a political crisis, and then you have the attendant social crisis happening as well.
Yeah.
And one of the arguments that have been made by scholars and intellectuals, thought leaders out there, is that the current crisis is a result of a crisis in governance, of leadership, of the elites that are in power.
For the benefit of everyone listening, how would you define elites?
Right. That's an interesting one. I was recently listening to this podcast on elite politics. I can tell you the name of that later. But there they were, going through some of the criteria on how would an elite be defined. Yeah. And I think historically that's something that has, changed. Some of the elites that came into power in the past was based on hereditary lines. So you have the monarchist kind of rule.
Yeah.
And then afterwards it transitions into more of a democratic, kind of representative form of rule. So you can have, elites that are chosen on based on their bloodlines, or then based on the wealth that they have. And then in our recent past, right, it changes to education, or increasingly calls for social justice, that an elite should have social justice as, a big part of their manifesto.
What I was thinking about was post-independence. We've never had a period where the elites were not in power.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So why do you think that we were just okay with it?
I don't know if it was a fact that we were okay with it, right? I think the way in which the power transitioned from the colonial rulers to, the leaders that came into power at independence, I think that, the system that was in place, the particular systems of privilege that were in place, meant that that transition was still very much self-contained within a particular group of economic and political elite.
Yeah.
And so that does not negate that, that there were significant movements in the period before that were led by mass movements that were very organic. But, these movements, I think, were often draconian. In a draconian manner, they were crushed by the colonial forces.
Yeah.
In other cases, they were absorbed or they were kind of fragmented by nationalist divide and rule kind of, discourse.
Yeah.
And I think because of all of these factors, that the systems of elite power were not really dislocated or disrupted.
Would you say there's been an evolution of the elite class over the decades, or since independence or even pre-independence, over the past few decades? Like, for example, how much of a factor did caste play into it, and then like through social mobility and like as people,
I've
acquired more wealth, and then
right. Well, I mean, let me kind of turn that question over to you, right? In the sense that how would we define elites, right? So we can start off with elites would be a group that has power, right? So then would we define that as political power or economic power? What would your answer be?
I would say both.
Yeah.
Right. So then in that case, when if you look at certain historic moments after independence, say in 77 we have the open economy. So I'm sure that some of the, systems of elites, the nature of them would have changed, but also arguably that it remained still within.
Would you say people like Ranasinghe Premadasa
yes.
represent that same class, given his background?
I think that elite systems are very stable, but that of course they can evolve in very small ways as well. So if Ranasinghe Premadasa was able to enter into an established paradigm of an elite class because of the political power that he had, I don't think that it actually substantially changed the caste kind of politics that were in place.
So regardless of the caste differences or whatever, they're still trying to maintain the status quo, right? Is what
yes,
you're saying,
yes. I don't think that at the social level that there is any significant transformation in terms of dismantling these elite hierarchies.
And they have been calling the shots ever since.
Yes.
And is that changing, would you say?
Well, that's I think something that we can all kind of discuss and argue about, right? Because we hear this discourse that the present moment is kind of a transformational moment, one where, because these mass protests are, they clearly have an anti-elite kind of agenda, an anti-elite kind of discourse.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, Tamara, also this notion of inter-ethnic and inter-religious harmony. But I have also heard, the cynics and skeptics say that that this moment is actually one that is driven by an economic fallout. And that even though, yes, there is a potential for a more transformational, united, emancipatory struggle, I still lean towards.
So you disagree that it's economic in nature?
No, I completely agree that it is economic in nature. And so I think even though the potential remains for there to be, a more anti-elite, powerful movement,
right,
I feel like still a lot more things have to happen.
Okay. Yeah. But in your view,
yes,
what would you say were the roots of this present crisis?
Economic. I mean, like I mentioned before, it's a crisis in governance. But of course, that crisis in governance is very closely linked to the economic crisis.
What exactly is the crisis in governance?
Just poor leadership, policy decisions that were taken with regard to, policies,
right,
not only in the economic sphere, right, but of course in the social and political spheres as well, which has led us to a situation that we could have easily avoided.
No, I would also agree with you there that the fact that people are together now than ever before has more to do with the economic condition than anything else. We had to, stoop down to this level for people to realize that it's not your neighbor it's not your Muslim neighbor that is working against. It's the political elite that has always been out for blood. So do you see this elite system actually changing? Because even though we now have a lot of people on the roads protesting and asking for change, how would toppling the elite system look like in a practical scenario? Like, what would be a different system that would work?
So I think in order to answer that question, right, I think first we collectively as a society need to come to some kind of consensus, right, on what kind of elites we want to have and what would they look like. And I think then the second part of that answer would be, if even if we do want to get rid of the elites that are in power right now, we have to address the question of how historically in any country it has always been very difficult to topple elites. So we have to kind of, poke and examine that question. Why has it been so difficult to get ruling elites out of power?
Okay, when you say get rid of the elite, how does that work? What does that look like?
To topple the ruling elites out of power.
No, okay, and replace it with what?
That's the question I'm asking you. But in order to answer that, as a society, we need to come to some kind of consensus on what would the new elites look like. Are there people, with substantially different personal attributes, or are there people who are subject to, institutional arrangements that would help them to look like different kinds of elites? Or are we looking for a society in which elite structures are not so vital, so a much more egalitarian kind of society? So as a society, if we can come to that kind of consensus, then we can, work towards establishing that new order. But one of my concerns is that, we do not have that kind of consensus yet. We can arrive at it, hopefully, through the current, people's protests that are happening.
So you are for use in the present crisis to bring about that kind of transformative reform change? I
mean, I always have the hope that is the case, right? Such transformative moments are very rare.
Right.
And also, regardless of whether I hope for it or not, I think that the forces in motion that, take off can lead to places that we can't predict. But, I always think so. Yes.
How confident are you that this is what the people want?
What is what the people want?
How confident are you that this transformative change that you speak of is that this is what that is what the people want currently, and not food on the table and gas to cook their food with and on the clock electricity?
Well, like I mentioned before, part of me does think that the current protests are largely driven by self-interested economic motives, but I also think that when shifts in society happens, it usually happens when ideas that have been prevailing get superseded by other ideas, right? So if the current moment is one where the ideas that have been shared, the knowledge that is being shared is one which emphasizes that this is a transformational moment of unity and egalitarianism and social justice. If that shift in balance of forces actually does happen, then I do think that there is a potential for such transformational change to take place.
It's a tall order, though, don't you think? I mean, people always, like Himal said before, the moment that they have food on their table again, and gas supply and fuel supply and stuff like that. I am a pessimist by nature, so what I always thought was, if things get even a little bit better with with aid coming in hopefully and stuff like that, the calls for justice for past atrocities done by the state and transformative things like repealing the 19th Amendment and stuff like that, I think those demands would go back to being within the circles of people who've always been asking for those things and not the general populace.
You mean abolishing the executive presidency, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the idea that the economics is the determinant at the end of the day, I think that's a very strong argument. But like I said before, I think there is a significant section of society, at least I am one among them, which believes that the ideological discourse.
Yeah. So no, my question is that discourse, those demands, are they limited to significantly small intellectual class that does not necessarily represent the wider community?
That could be actually a very big concern. And so I think that kind of discourse, if it is more mainstream, if there is more, if there's more receptivity to it within the mainstream, then we have the markings of a transformational moment.
Right.
What can we do to make it mainstream?
Well, things like this, I think, podcasts,
like
protests, conversations among people.
Activism,
yes.
Yeah. There's a lot of conversation on singular, like social media, Facebook especially,
right,
where people are now like more receptive than ever to ideas like, for example, the whole war crimes thing. Like,
yes.
Now people are having conversations about it openly.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was unthinkable not too long ago, maybe even a couple of years ago.
Yes, including that video, right? What was it called?
The Channel 4 video.
No,
Killing Fields.
I think the one after that. There was another one. recently, where like I saw several people on social media.
that got shared widely as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So those things, what you're saying is right. There has been a
people are more conscious,
more receptive to those ideas. I think earlier a lot of people just used to tune those out.
Yes.
Because
or if not outright deny, like people lived in complete denial.
The conflict was so the military was so glorified. It was unthinkable that war crimes and crimes against humanity were going on. While
I think a lot of people genuinely, sincerely believe the zero casualties narrative, right?
Yes. Yes. But I think then that goes back to the original framework of our conversation, right? Which is on elite and the mass relationship, and that the elites kind of one of the central ways in which the central way in which they manage to stay in power is by these lies that they tell the people, right? And the more that these untruths are kind of exposed and deconstructed, the more fragile the elites hold on power is. And so in your question on how can we get rid of the elites that are in power, that is definitely one, right? Closing the information gap, informing ourselves, becoming more aware of the of these abuses that the state has been doing and the untruths that have been told to the public.
I suppose now is the time for that.
Why not now, right? Now is better than tomorrow.
If not now, when?
Yes.
Right? Yeah. How much of an appetite do you think the public has for that kind of conversation currently?
Again, I think we might be underestimating the public.
I'm just playing devil's advocate.
Yes.
I'm not saying we shouldn't take
yes.
hold of this moment and seize the moment and just kind of
yes.
go all in. I'm saying that's definitely a good thing to do.
Yes. I think we might be underestimating the public and overestimating the role of the individual.
Right.
So I think that, you know, if the receptivity within the public, I believe that it's always there. And I don't think it's the responsibility of any one particular individual. And so once these forces get set in motion, I have the hope, if they are steered as well, you know, like through certain thought leaders and public leaders, and they are steered correctly, I think that, again, that they have the markings of a transformational moment.
And who do you think should take charge?
The people, right? So again, that's a very, I know, answer, an escapist answer.
One of the things that was said about the protest was some people were saying that there is no leadership within this movement and there's no one to take charge and represent the people.
Yes.
And is that a good way to go? Should the people, I don't know, sort of get together and appoint a leader? Like how would something like this end?
That's an interesting question, you know, and I'd be interested to hear what you guys think about it as well. There is always a benefit and a downside of movements not having leaders, right? Again, we can't really prescribe how a particular movement should be. The fact that it's, you know, organically taken off, it doesn't really have a very set of leaders, could be positive. I mean, there are the standard arguments for that, right? Because so that the movement doesn't depend too much on them, there isn't the risk of ego is coming into place and stuff like that. But then I also think that a middle ground has to be struck, and that in order for a movement to be strategic, there has to be at least one level or one stratum of providing leadership to the movement. And I think that is already ongoing, you know, in some ways. We saw that the Aragala movement had presented, right, 8 demands that some of the groups had got together and presented 8 demands.
But some people contest that.
Yes.
And I think one of the criticisms was some groups were trying to, for like a bit of a hijack the people's movement and turn it into their own gain.
Yes. So, but that's good, right? If there's a pushback against that, then there are the tensions. And so hopefully what comes out between these tensions is that there's a bit of back and forth. But most importantly is that, you know, that this movement then takes on some kind of strategic form. It doesn't have to be organized, but it needs to be strategic, because there has to be a point of this people's protests.
Has the Aragalia changed somewhat since Ranil was appointed Prime Minister?
My sense and from what I hear people say is that there has been a slight dampening effect after the Prime Minister came into office.
Why do you think that was the case?
I think it's a lot of reasons, right? I'm going to offer one and then see what you guys are going to come up with. One is just the exhaustion of trying to meet your livelihoods, right? Make sure that you have a livelihood and to look after your families, and not being able to physically be on the protest ground. But that doesn't mean that you aren't resisting the injustices that the state is imposing upon you. in your day-to-day life. Those resistance are always ongoing.
No, yeah, I would agree with that as well. And I think one of the first things that the new Prime Minister did after he was appointed was to address the nation, and the way that he talked about the crisis, the previous leaders hadn't done that before. They hadn't openly admitted how much of trouble we are in.
Yes.
So I think that had an effect on people. But then again, the how he came into that position and how he was appointed by the president, it also shows the disdain that the elite class has for the people's struggle, right? Because
Yes.
nobody asked for Ranil Wickremesinghe was not anyone's first choice
Yes.
for prime minister,
Yeah.
and there was always talk about deal politics going
Yes.
on, how Ranil sort of
I think that's really interesting. When you talk about the unaccountability of Ranil's appointment, again, when we go back to the topic of elite politics,
Yeah.
one of the main ways in which they manage to stay their hold on power is not in like the not catastrophic, but not in like the spectacular moments, but it's in these everyday, day-to-day deals and back channels and privilege systems that these elite sustain.
Yeah.
And so, the appointment...
No, I think even when this whole thing started, when people started coming to the roads, I think we all knew in the back of our minds that we were never going to hold the Rajapakshas accountable for their crimes.
Yes.
And with Ranil's appointment, it just it was a confirmation of that fact.
Yes. Yes.
And now we are trying...
Yes.
We are finding it difficult to let go of to accept the fact that the Rajapakshas are going to get away scot-free.
Yes.
So I think that's what people are finding it difficult to deal with. But I think we always knew that they were not going to answer for their crimes.
Yes. And I mean, and then after that, the subsequent appointment of the cabinet ministers, I think that's significantly disrupted whatever credibility. I mean, it was already low to start off with. So whatever credibility the current government has had, come on, if you look at the appointments, it's just very, it's not surprising, but I think as a Sri Lankan, we always discover new ways to get disappointed when you think you can't, get disappointed anymore.
Yeah.
How sincere do you think the opposition parties were in their rejection of calls for a unity government, for a national government?
I always see these things theoretically, but I think, again, going back to elite politics, talking about the role of the opposition is, I think, significant in trying to understand how the ruling elite stays in power, and the opposition is also part of the ruling elite, right? So
that's what we are told, right? That they need together.
Yes, and I mean, I think it's very obvious at this point.
Would you include the NPP in that?
At the end of the day, they are also trying to get hold of parliamentary power.
Are they? Oh, sorry, do you mean parliamentary power, like government? Do they want actual power? Do they want to be in government?
I mean, not in the present interim government, but they do want to, right? And so I think political parties should always, we can safely assume that, most of them...
They're always thinking about the next election.
Yes.
Right.
Maybe there are some individuals that, don't have to take that criticism, but looking at how politics have been done in this country, I think it's safe to say that.
So what should have been the alternative if Ranil hadn't taken this job?
I mean, something that I've been hearing about, right, which is that the Rajapaksas were backed up against the wall, and that if a bit more pressure had been exerted on them, maybe a deal that was less disconnected with what the people were asking for could have been reached, but now that moment has been lost. I think. Many people could disagree with me, but I feel like that moment has been lost. Maybe another similar moment can be created, but right now we are facing a very serious humanitarian crisis, and I don't know if another political crisis can be drawn into that.
I think one of the other things that became very apparent during this whole situation was the fact that institutions like the police and the military, how they support these elite structures, and how they have... A lot of people had not realized that before. And like I said earlier, with the glorification of the military, a lot of people always had this idea where the military were the saviors, of the people, and with this, I think a lot of people realize that is not the case. The police and the military are there to support and protect the ruling class and not the people.
Yes.
I think that was one of the important realizations. One of the I would call it one of the wins that came with this whole Aragalaya, because realizations like that lay the groundwork for people to be receptive to, like we talked about before, the war crimes that has happened
Yes.
in this country and crimes against humanity. So
Hmm.
I was actually very happy to see how people with different political inclinations come to that realization.
Yes. Well, I think that Sri Lanka was, like you said, very late to come to that realization. Even when the people's protest started off, one of the earliest discourses that we heard was don't turn against the police, right? So there was this sympathy towards them. They are also going through similar livelihood challenges that we are going through, and that it is in the government's interest to turn the people against the police. But I think just only a couple of weeks after that, when the police cracked down on the protesters, especially in the parliament, that was kind of the wake-up moment for so much of, I guess it's safe to say, middle-class protesters. But on a global scale, we have seen, the abolition now of police movements happening with, the Black Lives Matter. In Australia, the discourse on holding the police more accountable to their actions has been ongoing for so long. These are the contexts that I'm aware of. Sri Lanka has been so far behind these conversations, like you said, because of the triumphalism that followed the military so-called victory. That, again, I am very hesitant to believe that even now that we truly kind of, see the military or the police for what they are. And what they are is that they manage the relationship between the elites and the masses. They make sure that the interests of the elites are sustained, and they do it in very institutionalized ways. And the problem with the post-war triumphalism is that the military has been portrayed in very sentimental terms, right, as our boys, kind of disrupting that ideological sentimental aspect. I think that would be our first victory. The protests have, I think, made the first crack at that. But I think also important here to talk about is the military's presence in the north, right? What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are only just becoming aware of how bad it is.
But how is that possible? That's my question. How is it that people can be so disconnected with what is going on in the north when they are very well informed of some education policy that is going on in the US? Why aren't we more concerned with informing ourselves of what's going on in our country? What do you think?
It's a combination of effective propaganda and a lot of self-delusion and denial on the part of the Sinhalese.
Right.
We just didn't want to admit that there were so many atrocities taking place.
Yeah, for me that is baffling, because not to take a higher ground, but it is obvious, right? If you travel to Jaffna, and again I think only see the surface of it. You see the amount of checkpoints there. When you hear the stories that some of the local NGOs talk to you about, the amount of surveillance on the journalists that are happening there, it is such an everyday thing, and it has been ongoing for so long that I think it's embarrassing for people in the south to now be so vocally shocked that the police and military are acting in this way.
It's a start, though.
It's a start, but like I said, it's embarrassing. We should not be feeling proud about it. That we have reached this moment.
Okay, so within a representative democracy, is it even possible to topple elitism? Or is there, purely being hypothetical, is there some sort of utopia where the elitism is not present, something that we can maybe strive for?
Yes. So I think in terms of toppling the elites, so we are talking about structural, legal kind of changes. But before we get there, like I said before, I think we need to reach, as a society, some kind of deliberative consensus on what should the new elite look like, what are the systems that, should be put in place to hold these elites accountable to the standards we want them to have. Once we have, some kind of clarity and movement on that there are already talks about these things, right? Like a national council, state council to act as a watchdog, parliamentary oversight committees, things like these. But then also, other accountability mechanisms at the local levels. We can have civil society-led, youth-led initiatives as such. So it is through these, ground-up, bottom-up, organic ways. And like I said before, ideological discourse, that is the main point of transformation that has to take place. Once that happens, I think then, toppling an order is fine.
Okay, with that hopeful note, I think we can wrap it up for today. I think it should be mentioned that Rajni is also part of this new website called debus.lk, where she and Himal will be writing about stuff like this, stuff that we talked about today. So definitely go and check that out. Thank you so much, Rajni, for joining us today.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
All right. Catch you guys soon, hopefully.
Yeah. See you
Yeah.
later.
Peace.